So this talk is called Seven Deadly Startup Sins. And as was just mentioned, I do a lot of work with Techstars, mentoring new startups, and also just kind of come across a lot of people who are starting technology companies in New York, in San Francisco, and other places. And what I was finding over the past couple years is that a lot of the companies I talk to, especially the very early stage ones, kind of have the same issues or the same problems. And so when I'm mentoring them, I found myself giving the same feedback again and again. So for this talk, I went through all my emails and conversations that I've had with some of these companies and tried to consolidate those discussions into kind of 7 problems that I see again and again. And I'm going to try to give you those problems in the hopes that maybe you can avoid some of them. Inevitably, startup people are strong-willed, so you're probably going to make the same mistakes. But in a year or two from now, hopefully you can remember this talk and say, oh yeah, I should have listened to him when I heard it then. So the first one I think might be particularly relevant here. I was at the hackathon yesterday, and I was talking to somebody who was participating, and he told me that Romania is one of the most paranoid countries in Europe. So you have a great idea, right, and you've just come up with it, and somebody comes and has a conversation with you, and they say, oh, well, what are you working on? And you say, well, you know, I can't tell you. I'm in stealth mode. And this is probably the #1 thing that I hear from new startups when I ask them what they're working on, is they tell me that I'm in stealth, I can't talk about it. And the motivation is really obvious here, right? You have a great idea, you've spent a long time coming up with it, you're convinced it's the next billion-dollar idea, you don't want anybody else to steal it. And of course, the second you tell it to somebody, that person is gonna drop everything, take your idea, and start working on it for themselves. So the first deadly sin is stealth. Don't do this. Don't be in stealth mode. This is kind of the ultimate amateur move that I think repeat serial entrepreneurs see new first-timers making, is being secretive about what they're working on. And why is that so bad? Because intuitively, it seems like being secretive about what you're working on would be good, again, because you don't want people to steal it. Well, the first reality is that what you're working on is probably not unique. In fact, it's probably been tried half a dozen or a dozen times before and failed each time. And because it's failed each time, you haven't heard about it. But the person you're talking to might have heard about it. And so if you were to tell them what you were working on, they might actually have some helpful feedback for you. Or they might know the person who's going to be your CTO or your head of marketing or your first investor. Because the thing that you learn when you've done this for a couple years is that startups aren't built by one person. It takes a village, so to speak. And you know, just like when you read a novel and they have a long list of acknowledgments at the end of the novel, a startup has a long list of acknowledgments or people who've helped them along the way. And if you're not telling people what you're working on, there's no way for them to help you. But more than that, experienced entrepreneurs, investors, et cetera, are not going to want to work with you. They're not going to be interested. You need to kind of captivate them, and you do that by telling people what you're working on, not by asking them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So don't do that either. Don't say, well, I can tell you, but first sign this NDA. It just doesn't work like that. And the reality is that everybody else has their own stuff that they're working on. And the best ideas usually seem like the dumbest ideas at the beginning. Airbnb, for example, was an idea for renting the floor space of people's houses for big conferences, right? If I told you that idea, you'd be like, well, okay, that sounds like a horrible idea. I'm definitely not going to steal that idea. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar company. So the first thing is, don't be stealthy. Tell everybody what you're working on. So the second deadly sin is building a better product. And usually the way I hear about this is after I've convinced somebody to actually tell me their idea. I say, what are you working on? They say, okay, well, friend DA, I'll tell you what I'm working on. It's a better version of Yelp. I'm like, a better version of Yelp. Okay, well, what makes it better? And they're like, well, you know, I really love going out with groups, and Yelp doesn't let me search for groups. I'm going to add that feature to it, and that's going to make it a better product. And the real problem with building a, quote, better product is that it's the wrong mindset, right? It's a very product-oriented mindset, And the goal in a startup is not to build better products, it's to build better experiences. It's to make people's lives better or easier or cheaper, right? So as soon as you're thinking about building a better version of X, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. You're thinking about the wrong things. You're thinking about it from the perspective of a spec, right? You're tallying up the features that one product has, and you're saying, well, it's missing this one, and if I just add those, then I'll have something successful. But if you look at the really successful companies, and my bias is naturally towards consumer, social, particularly mobile apps, so that's what this talk kind of focuses on. But if you look at Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, etc., Instagram wasn't a better version of Facebook. It was simply different. Snapchat wasn't a better version of Instagram. It was different. And Peter Thiel talks really effectively on this issue when he tells people not to compete. It's not about competing. Competing is about building a better product. And consumers have a very limited ability to distinguish what's better, right? First of all, they value the things that they use already very highly. So people value the status quo. They don't like to change. And they underestimate the value of any new product. So if you're trying to be better, you really have to be like 10x better. And in something like search or recommendations, it's extremely hard to be 10x better. So instead of being better, be different. Solve a unique problem. Try to do something that somebody else isn't doing. The way Thiel phrases it is, what's your secret? What do you believe that other people don't believe to be true, right? And so that's the first question that I often ask people when they tell me what their idea is. I say, what's your secret? What do you believe about this space that other people don't believe? It's what's the counterintuitive part of it. When we were building Wander, we looked at Yelp, and what we believed about Yelp that was counterintuitive is that it really wasn't about recommendations. We believed that it was about expression. We thought Yelp was actually a blogging platform, and so the way to compete with them was not by giving better recommendations, but by being better for blogging, right? By letting people be more expressive and express themselves around location. So the third thing is attachment, and some of the other speakers have talked about this before. Mick talked about it in the context of Undrip, but you spent months or years building a team, raising money, launching a product, and you're dedicated to it. You're super attached to it. You want it to succeed. But the reality for most products is that you launch them and they just don't work, right? So you've worked super hard on something and you've launched it, and now you have like 100 downloads in the App Store. And you don't want to give up on it because you've sunk so much time and energy into this thing. The reality, though, is get over that sunk cost fallacy. You need to just move on and let it die, because what happens if you don't let it die and move on is you both go down together. So you have this kind of Romeo and Juliet thing where if you're too attached to your product, if you can't see that it's not working and that you have to move on, not only does your product fail, but you're going to fail as an entrepreneur. So flexibility seems like something that would be really good and really valuable, and in some respects it is, but a lot of times what ends up when you're too flexible is you end up with copycat products. You end up looking like everybody else. And what you really want is to be differentiated. You want to have an extremely strong opinion that other people don't have, and you want to be dedicated to that opinion. And now that's different than being dedicated to a specific product or specific tactic, but you want to have a hypothesis about the world that you believe very strongly and that you're inflexible on. And if you can do that, it's going to make you much stronger. But what happens when people are trying to build a better product, when they're too attached to it, when they're too flexible, is that they think, well, it's not working, but if I add this one feature, that's going to make it great. That's going to make it work. So maximalism is really the opposite of minimally viable. And I have this example of the Titanic here, right? The Titanic, they thought of everything. They put in all the bells and whistles, and what happened to it at the end? Well, it didn't work, to put it lightly. And you don't want your startup to be the Titanic. You want to have something really narrow and really crisp, a really testable hypothesis, And you want your first version to be designed to give you feedback on whether that hypothesis works or not. So the way I think about what the MVP should be is that if I launch my MVP and it doesn't work, I just move on, because I've convinced myself that no incremental feature is going to make it work if that core thing doesn't work. The core thing has to work, and every time you add another feature to it, it makes it harder and harder to discern whether the core thing is working or not working, or what the problem in your user flow is, or anything like that. So being really narrow, keeping features to a minimum, preventing product creep and bloat. You're probably familiar with this from service work if you've done that before, right? Somebody gives you a spec, but then the spec suddenly balloons every time you're building something. They come up with a new idea and they say, well, actually, I want to add chat into it. I think it would be really great if we just had chat. Oh, and now I want to have email notifications in addition to push notifications. That's just going to make it great, and it just really doesn't work like that. So being really disciplined is super important, and this is probably one of the hardest things to do about building product, is being minimal about it and being disciplined about not letting new features in, not believing that the next feature is going to be your saving grace. So nonchalance, being super cool and relaxed about things, is great in certain respects, but in regards to intros, raising money, there's simply ways that things are done. And this is one of the things that an accelerator is excellent for. I participated in Techstars. I'm a mentor with them. And Techstars and other accelerators are great for teaching you how to respond to email intros, how to get introed in the first place, how to approach investors, how to raise money. But what you should do, and even before you get into an accelerator, a mistake that I've seen a lot of people who enter Techstars and other programs make, is they just take things kind of too casually. They just say, well, I'll kind of figure it out. There's so many amazing resources online right now that there's really no excuse for doing things the wrong way when there is an explicitly right way. Quora is a really great resource for entrepreneurship. There's a bunch of investors who have fantastic blogs, from Fred Wilson to Chris Dixon to Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen. You should be reading all this stuff regularly, and they're going to have posts that address kind of all the basic bread and butter cases of things that you're going to have to do as an entrepreneur, the little things like responding to email, setting up meetings, et cetera, that you just want to make sure you're doing in the right way. And you want to make sure that you're following up with people, you're sending your thank you emails. That's really important. I offer to help people all the time, and then if I don't get a follow-up from them, I just assume they're not really that interested in my help. So prove it to me by following up, by showing me your interest in doing all the other things that indicate that you're serious and you've invested time in figuring out the space in which you're working. So the final deadly sin is magical thinking. And I see this a lot in consumer products because people think that they're going to build something, and if you build it, they will come, that great field of dreams sentiment, right? So you're going to build this great product, and then people are just going to recognize how great it is and download it from the App Store. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Especially for consumer stuff, you have to put a lot of thought and time into figuring out how your distribution is going to work. How are people going to find out about your product? Because I've worked a little bit in travel, I see this problem all the time in travel where people are building new things. And the problem with the travel space and many other spaces is that they're not very frequent activities. Most people are not traveling, for instance, more than they are traveling. So this is not a product that somebody could use every day. And if they're not using it every day, that's not very many opportunities to share it. And the golden age of SEO is over. That's why a lot of the really successful travel companies come from that era where you could just search in once or twice a year, like flights, and then you'd get kayak or something like that. It's much harder now. So if you don't have access to SEO, how are people going to figure it out? And so the successful social products today have done a good job of leveraging other social products, for instance, Instagram with Twitter or Meerkat very recently, leveraging off Twitter to help people discover it. So one bonus one, which is taking startup advice as gospel. So this applies to my own talk, to all the other talks here. I see a lot of people making this mistake where they read a startup blog post and then that's like their new religion and they follow that to a T. Recognize that every circumstance is different. There's always exceptions to rules. And so what's right for one might not be right for another. Understand the bias that your speakers are bringing to it. For instance, my bias is very consumer, mobile, social, US, male, white, etc. Understanding what those biases are and why the advice that people are giving may or may not apply to you, I think is really important and relevant. So, thank you.
Wow. We now have some really disciplined speakers on stage, so next time we'll let you talk earlier, and then we'll not fall as much behind in the agenda. So while we get John on stage, we'll also take like one more question from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question for Jeremy. Okay. Okay, then I'll ask you a question. Sure. So, which of the sin have you personally fallen up most for?
Probably all of them, actually.
All of them most?
I mean, I know that at the very beginning I was super secretive about what I was working on. That's why I like to start with that one, and I really emphasize it because I just kind of cringe when I think of some of the conversations I had early on, and I refused to tell people what I was working on, and I missed out on a lot of good help and valuable advice for that reason. So,
yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.